My name is Captain Thora James, though most people, including my own family, only know me as the civilian analyst from Raleigh. In 2 days, I will attend my brother-in-law's promotion ceremony at Fort Liberty, a ceremony my own sister just told me I was not invited to, as my presence would be bad for their image. What she doesn't know, what none of them have ever bothered to learn, is that I won't be attending as her embarrassing older sister. I will be attending as a guest of honor, personally invited by the 4-star general presiding over the event. They wanted me to be invisible. They are about to discover just how visible I can be. Have you ever felt that sting of being deliberately left out by your own family? If you know what that's like, comment 1 below and like this story. Because what I did next wasn't just for me, it was for everyone who's ever been told they don't belong. It all began less than an hour ago, in what felt like a different lifetime. A rare moment of earned peace. My life in Raleigh is a fortress of quiet discipline. By day, I'm a senior strategic analyst for a private security firm, a world of encrypted data and classified briefings. My office is a reflection of my mind, a minimalist space of glass and brushed steel, 20 floors above the city, where my worth is measured in observable facts and tangible results, not in the volatile market of familial opinion. It is my sanctuary. The late afternoon sun was slanting across my desk, illuminating the glow of a single email on my monitor. The subject line was clean and direct. Official commendation. My heart gave a steady, quiet beat as I read the text for what must have been the 5th time. The words were from a 4-star general at the Pentagon, a man whose name commands respect in rooms I have only read about. For 3 months, my work, my silent, unseen, thankless work, had been the analytical spine of an operation that kept his people safe. He called my intelligence report exemplary and decisive. A small private smile touched my lips, one that never reached my eyes in family photos. This was real. This was the unvarnished proof of hundreds of hours spent connecting dots that others saw as empty space. In the sterile quiet of my office, I felt a profound sense of recognition. I felt seen. I took a sip of my black coffee, the bitter heat a familiar anchor, the taste of a day's work well and truly done. It was in that precise moment of fragile contentment that my phone vibrated on the desk. The screen lit up with a name that could still, after all these years, send a jolt of foolish hope through me. Serafina. My little sister. For a second, I let myself believe she was calling to share in the excitement for her husband Declan's promotion. He was making lieutenant colonel, a massive achievement, and my pride for him was genuine. I answered, my voice warmer than it had been all day. Hey, Sarah, just thinking about you guys. Getting ready for the big day? Her voice dripped through the speaker, as sweet and cloying as honey. It was the voice she used right before she asked for something, or took something away. Thora, hi. So glad I caught you. Listen, I'm calling about the promotion. She deployed a practiced pause, a little theatrical beat of hesitation. Declan and I have been talking, and we've decided to make it a more intimate affair. You know, just for people within the military community. It's an image thing. You get it? The air in my office turned sharp and cold. Each word was a tiny, poisoned dart delivered with a smile. My mind raced, trying to find a loophole, an excuse, any reason other than the one staring me in the face. But I'm family, I said, the words feeling weak and pathetic even to my own ears. Serafina laughed. It was a light, tinkling sound that had always grated on my nerves, the sound of effortless dismissal. Oh, sweetie, of course you are. But this isn't about family. This is business. This is about Declan's career. It's about being with people who understand. She hit the word understand with a delicate surgical precision, and with it, she sliced me out of the picture. On one side of the line, the world of uniforms and rank, the world of consequence she wore like a borrowed gown. On the other, me, the civilian, the outsider, the sister who, despite everything, just didn't get it. A few more hollow pleasantries, and she was gone. I sat in absolute stillness, the phone in my hand now an inert, cold weight. My sanctuary, my pristine office suddenly felt like an interrogation room. The brilliant Raleigh skyline outside my window seemed to mock me, a world of motion and purpose I was no longer a part of. My own world had just collapsed into the hollow ache in my sternum. My gaze drifted back to the monitor. The general's praise, exemplary and decisive, shimmered on the screen like a mirage. What was a commendation from the Pentagon against a condemnation from my own blood? The deepest pain wasn't about missing a party. It was about receiving the official, verbal notification of a verdict I'd felt my entire life. You are not one of us. You do not belong. There were no tears. Crying was a surrender, and I had surrendered enough for one lifetime. My training, my discipline, the very things they dismissed, kicked in. I rose from my chair, my movements fluid and controlled. I walked to the small kitchenette, my heels clicking softly on the floor. I poured a glass of ice, cold water from the cooler, and drank it down in one long, deliberate swallow. The shock of the cold was clarifying, washing away the fog of hurt. When I walked back to my desk, my reflection in the dark glass of the window showed a different woman. The wounded older sister had retreated. The intelligence officer was now in command. A target had been identified. A strategy was required. I opened the general's email one last time. I wasn't reading it for comfort anymore. I was reading it as a tactical brief. I noted his title, his office, the formal, respectful language he had used when he'd invited me personally just yesterday. My fingers, now steady and sure, moved to the keyboard. The sharp, rhythmic clicks were the only sound in the room. General Morrison, thank you for the invitation. I would be honored to attend and celebrate Lieutenant Colonel Thorne's promotion. Respectfully, Captain Thora James, U.S. Army Reserve. I hit send. The click of the mouse was barely audible, but it landed with the force of a gavel. This wasn't a petulant act of revenge. This was a calculated strategic maneuver. This was a silent declaration of war, not to destroy them, but to reclaim the one piece of territory they had tried to take from me for good: my own self-worth. The single word, sent, confirmed my action on the screen. The adrenaline from hitting that button began to fade, replaced by the heavy silence of my office. The decision was made. The die was cast. Now, there was nothing left to do but go home. I packed my laptop into my bag and reached for my wallet. As I pulled it from my purse, a small worn photograph with curled edges slipped out, fluttering down onto the dark wood of my desk. I picked it up. It was me and Serafina, maybe 16 and 14. Our arms slung around each other's shoulders, grinning at the camera with the unself-conscious bliss of youth. A relic from a time before the unspoken rules were written, before our roles were cast in stone. The smiling faces in the photograph were a stark contrast to the cold, hollow feeling her voice had left in my chest. Looking at it, the walls I'd so carefully built around my heart began to crumble, and the memories flooded in, not as a gentle stream, but as a tidal wave of injustice. The first wave took me back to my sophomore year at UNC Chapel Hill. I was 20, and the biggest thing in my world was the upcoming spring formal. I'd saved for 2 months, working extra shifts at the campus library, to buy a simple, elegant navy blue dress. It wasn't designer, but it was mine. A week before the dance, Serafina called me, sobbing hysterically. She was in some kind of trouble, she said. A critical school expense she couldn't tell mom and dad about. She needed money, and she needed it now. Without a second's hesitation, I told her I'd handle it. I sold my ticket to the formal to a girl in my dorm, returned the dress, and picked up a grueling double-shift bartending at a sticky-floored dive bar just off Franklin Street. I spent that Saturday night, the night of the dance, wiping down counters that smelled of stale beer and regret, and wired every single dollar to her account. 2 days later, my heart sank as I scrolled through Facebook. There was Serafina, beaming in a photo album from a party. She was wearing a stunning, obviously expensive designer dress, one that cost at least 3 times what I had sent her. Her caption read, "Feeling like a princess." I stared at the screen, the feeling of her betrayal like a physical hand squeezing the air from my lungs. My sacrifice hadn't been for an emergency, it had been for a status symbol. I was not her sister, I was her secret ATM. That wasn't the first lesson, just the most expensive. The pattern had been set years earlier. When I was 17, I got into a minor fender bender in my dad's old Ford Taurus on the way home from my part-time job at the grocery store. No one was hurt, but there was a dent in the bumper. For a week, I was lectured relentlessly about responsibility, about how lucky I was that I didn't hurt anyone. I spent the entire summer working to pay for the repairs. I was held accountable. 2 years later, Serafina, then a freshman in college, called me at 2 in the morning, drunk and giggling, needing a ride home from a party she wasn't supposed to be at. I got out of bed, drove 45 minutes across town in the dead of night, and brought her home safely. When I told our parents the next morning, expecting them to be angry at her recklessness, my mother just sighed with relief. "Thank God she was smart enough to call you," she said. My father nodded in agreement. It's good she has a reliable sister. My safety had been an expectation. Her irresponsibility was reframed as wisdom. The double standard was a chasm I could never cross. The truth that I was only valued for my utility was carved deepest one miserable winter when I came down with a vicious case of pneumonia. I was living in my first off-campus apartment, and for days I was too weak to even get out of bed. My body aching with a fever that wouldn't break and a cough that felt like it was tearing my lungs apart. I finally called my mother, my voice a ragged whisper. "I'm really sick, Mom." Her reply was distracted, distant. "Oh, honey, drink plenty of water and get some rest," she said, her voice already turning away from the phone. "I have to go. Serafina needs me to help her pick out new curtains for her apartment." And then she hung up. An entire week went by. Not a single call or text from my sister. Not another word from my mother. The only person who checked on me was the elderly woman from down the hall, Mrs. Gable, who I'd only ever shared polite elevator greetings with. She knocked on my door with a container of homemade chicken noodle soup, her eyes full of a concern I was starving for. In that moment, as I held the warm container in my trembling hands, I understood a devastating truth. A near stranger cared more about my well-being than my own family did. I was invisible when I was in need. But the final exhibit, the one that sealed the verdict, came when Serafina and Declan decided to buy their first house. They were young, and with Declan's junior officer salary, they couldn't get approved for the mortgage on their own. Serafina came to me, her eyes filled with strategic tears, begging me to co-sign the loan. "Just for a year, Thora, I swear," she'd pleaded. "Just until Declan's finances are more stable." Against my better judgment, fueled by a lifetime of conditioning to be the dependable one, I agreed. I put my perfect credit score, my financial identity that I had painstakingly built, on the line for them. 3 years passed. They never refinanced. The topic was never brought up. Then, at a family Christmas party, Declan, a few beers in, slung his arm around my shoulder and said loudly enough for everyone to hear, "Good to have a safety net, right, Thora?" The room filled with chuckles. My parents, my aunts, my uncles, they all smiled. And I just stood there, feeling my face burn with humiliation, realizing I wasn't a sister. I wasn't even a person. I was a tool, a signature on a form, a financial backstop they could publicly joke about. I looked down at the photograph in my hand, at the two smiling girls who knew nothing of this future. The injustice of it all, the sheer weight of a lifetime of being taken for granted, settled in my bones. I didn't rip the photo. I didn't throw it away. With a newfound cold clarity, I slid it back into its slot in my wallet, the smooth plastic a barrier between the past and the present. I was done being their safety net. It was time to pull myself up by my own bootstraps, the ones I had been wearing all along. Sliding that old photograph back into my wallet wasn't just a simple action. It was a vow. A silent oath made in the cold quiet of my office that I would no longer walk the path they had laid out for me. From that moment on, I would forge my own, no matter how lonely it was. And it began with a single, liberating decision. After graduation, I was not going home. I stayed in Raleigh, renting a small studio apartment with peeling paint and a window that overlooked a brick wall. It wasn't much, but it was mine. My life became a study in self-reliance, built on a foundation of Kraft mac and cheese and walking shoes I bought on clearance at Walmart. The first paycheck from my entry-level data entry job felt more valuable than any check I'd ever received for my birthday. It was proof of my independence, a tangible piece of my new life. I didn't go out much. I didn't party. I worked. On weekends, I took a part-time job at the local Barnes& Noble, not just for the extra cash, but for the quiet refuge it offered. Surrounded by books, by a million other worlds, my own small one felt a little less lonely. I learned how to budget on a spreadsheet, how to make small investments, and how to pay every single one of my bills on time, every time. A quiet pride began to grow in me, a feeling that was wholly mine, unattached to anyone else's approval. But independence can be a heavy burden. There were nights the silence in my apartment was so loud it felt like a physical pressure. One such evening, scrolling aimlessly through YouTube on my laptop, I stumbled upon a TED Talk by a woman named Brené Brown. The title was The Power of Vulnerability. I clicked on it, expecting some self-help platitudes. Instead, I was transfixed. She spoke about shame, about fear, about the courage it takes to be imperfect. I listened to it again, and then a third time. For the first time in my life, someone was giving me the language for my own experience. She was telling me that my feelings of loneliness, of being broken and unworthy, were not a personal failing, but a fundamental part of the human experience. I devoured her books, starting with Daring Greatly. It was like finding a map to my own heart. I began to understand that my lifelong silence wasn't weakness or submission. It was a shield. An armor I had built to protect myself from the constant barrage of judgment. And as I read, a question began to form in my mind. A question that was both terrifying and electrifying. What would happen if I dared to be brave? What would happen if I stopped trying to be invisible and started trying to be seen on my own terms? That question led me to the most unexpected place, a U.S. Army Reserve recruiting center. The idea took root from a deep-seated exhaustion with the world of shifting loyalties and emotional favoritism I had grown up in. I craved a system based on merit. I wanted a place where your value was measured by objective standards, where rank and respect were earned, not inherited or borrowed. I thought of my grandfather, a quiet, stoic veteran of the Korean War, and the sense of calm, unshakable dignity he carried. I wanted a piece of that. I walked into the recruiting office, nervous and unsure, and spoke to a recruiter who looked me in the eye and listened, truly listened, to my reasons. He didn't sell me a dream. He presented me with a challenge. In the Army, he explained, what you do matters more than who you know. I felt a connection, a sense of rightness. This was it. This was a place where my resilience, my quiet perseverance, would be considered an asset, not something to be taken for granted. Officer candidate school was the hardest thing I'd ever done, physically and mentally. But it was also the fairest. And it was there I met Sergeant First Class Miller, a man everyone just called Chief. He was a 20-year veteran with a face like a roadmap of every desert he'd ever served in and eyes that could see right through your excuses. He was the toughest instructor we had, demanding a level of precision and discipline that broke many of the other candidates. But he was also ruthlessly fair. He saw everything. He never gave empty praise, so most of us were terrified of him. He saw my quiet intelligence, my refusal to complain, my relentless, methodical way of tackling every problem. One sweltering afternoon, after a grueling land navigation exercise that had left most of us exhausted and covered in mud, he pulled me aside. I braced myself for a critique. "James," he said, his voice a low gravel. I stood at attention. "Yes, Chief." He just looked at me for a long moment. "You don't whine," he stated, as if it were a tactical observation. "You just do the work. The Army needs more people like you." He turned and walked away before I could even respond. But those few words, spoken by a man who owed me nothing, who judged me solely on my performance, landed with more weight than every hollow compliment my family had ever given me. It wasn't praise. It was recognition. And in that moment, I knew I had finally found a place where I might, just might, belong. It was a belonging I had to build for myself, one exhausting, honorable step at a time, on a road I walked alone. The validation from Chief Miller was like water in a desert, stark, vital, and exactly what I needed to survive in that world. But I soon learned that there was another kind of nourishment, a warmth I didn't even know I was starving for until I found it. It began, as so many good things do, in a local coffee shop with worn wooden floors and the rich smell of roasted beans. I was tucked into a corner armchair, lost in a dense book on military strategy, when a man's voice gently broke my concentration. That looks like some heavy reading for a Saturday. I looked up to see a man with kind eyes and a friendly, unassuming smile. He introduced himself as Ben, a civil engineer who worked downtown. He wasn't intimidated by the complexity of my book. He was genuinely curious. Our conversation flowed with an ease that felt entirely new to me. He asked real questions about my work, not out of a morbid curiosity about warfare, but because he seemed to truly want to understand the world I inhabited. Ben was the complete opposite of Declan's loud, look-at-me brand of charisma. He had a quiet, steady presence that felt like bedrock. He listened more than he spoke, and when he did speak, his words were thoughtful and sincere. He never tried to fix me or offer unsolicited advice about my family, even as I slowly, cautiously, began to share pieces of my story. He simply sat with me, offering the rare and precious gift of his quiet, unwavering presence. With Ben, for the first time, I didn't feel like a project to be managed or a resource to be tapped. I just felt like me. A few months into our relationship, the true depth of his kindness revealed itself. I was returning to my apartment late one Sunday evening, completely drained. It had been a grueling weekend of field training exercises with my reserve unit, 2 days of mud, exhaustion, and simulated high-stress scenarios. All I wanted was a bowl of cereal and the oblivion of sleep. But when I pushed open my apartment door, a scent hit me that stopped me in my tracks. It wasn't the usual scent of stale air and my own solitude. It was the rich, warm aroma of garlic, oregano, and simmering tomato sauce. I stepped inside to find Ben in my kitchen, wearing an apron over his jeans and a dusting of flour on his nose. A pan of lasagna, bubbling under a blanket of melted cheese, was cooling on the stovetop. He turned, his face breaking into that easy smile. "Hey, you," he said softly. "I figured you'd be wiped. Go take a hot shower. Everything's almost ready." I just stood there, speechless. No one had ever done this for me. No one had ever anticipated my needs, ever taken care of me without being asked, without expecting something in return. It was such a simple, domestic act, yet it felt monumental. I walked into my bathroom, turned on the shower, and as the hot water streamed down my face, I began to cry. Not tears of sadness or pain, but tears of overwhelming cathartic relief. It was the breaking of a dam I didn't even know was there. That night, as we sat at my small kitchen table, sharing a meal he had made for me, in my own home, I felt a sense of belonging I had never known. For the first time, I felt truly at home. This new chosen family wasn't just Ben. It extended to the men and women in my unit. They came from all walks of life: teachers, plumbers, IT specialists, nurses. But on those training weekends, we were all soldiers, bound by a shared sense of duty and mutual respect. I remember one training exercise where I made a small but critical error in a navigation drill, costing my team precious time. I braced for the inevitable criticism, but instead, another officer, Captain Evans, simply clapped me on the shoulder as we cleaned our gear. "Don't sweat it, James," he said with a knowing look. "That's why we train. So we can make our mistakes here, not out there. You'll get it right next time." That simple act of understanding, of grace, was revolutionary. It fostered an environment where I could learn and grow without the constant fear of judgment. They saw me as Captain James, a fellow officer, a teammate. They didn't care who my sister was or what rank her husband held. They only cared about my competence and my character. I was part of a team, judged by my actions, not by my connections. And through it all, there was Chief Miller. After he retired, he became a kind of mentor, a surrogate father figure. We'd meet for coffee once a month at an old-school diner with cracked vinyl booths and waitresses who called everyone Hun. He would listen, his coffee growing cold, as I haltingly spoke of the latest drama with my family. He never judged or told me what to do, just listened with a profound, empathetic silence. One day, after I recounted a particularly absurd request from Serafina, he stirred his coffee for a long time before speaking. "Captain," he said, his voice low and steady, "you can't pour from an empty cup. Don't let them drain you dry. Your first duty, before your country, before your unit, is to yourself." His words landed with the force of a revelation. They weren't just words, they were permission. Permission to protect myself. Permission to build boundaries. He gave me a new perspective, one I'd learned from Oprah's talks on gratitude but had never fully applied to my own life. That night, for the first time, I started a new practice. Before bed, I wrote down 3 things I was grateful for. A man who cooks me lasagna. A team that has my back. A mentor who tells me the truth. That simple advice from Chief Miller planted a seed in my mind. Setting boundaries wasn't selfish. It was a necessary act of self-preservation, a lesson I would soon need more than ever. Chief Miller's advice about not pouring from an empty cup became my mantra. I carried it with me, a shield for the new, fragile boundaries I was trying to build around my life. For months, there was a peaceful, uninterrupted quiet on the family front. A part of me, the foolish, hopeful part, began to wonder if something had finally changed. But the past has a way of casting a long shadow, and I should have known the peace was only temporary. The call came on a Tuesday afternoon, after nearly 4 months of silence. The name, Serafina, lit up my phone, and my stomach immediately tightened. Her voice, when I answered, was unnaturally cheerful, as if we had spoken just yesterday. There were no questions about how I was or what was new in my life. She launched directly into her purpose. "Hey, sweetie, I have the most amazing favor to ask," she began, her voice bubbling with manufactured excitement. "Declan and I are just dying for a romantic getaway, and we found the perfect little cabin in Asheville for this weekend. I was wondering if you could possibly watch the kids for us." The request hung in the air, so casual, so breathtaking in its entitlement. I was not a sister being asked for a favor. I was a free, on-call babysitting service being activated. The years of progress I thought I'd made, the strength I'd built with Ben and my unit, all of it seemed to waver. The old Thora, the one conditioned to say yes, to please, to be the reliable one, rose up inside me. A painful, familiar war began in my chest. A part of me still craved her approval, still wanted to believe that this one small act of service might earn me a crumb of affection. I hesitated, the silence stretching on for a beat too long. But then, another voice cut through the noise, the low, gravelly voice of Chief Miller. "You can't pour from an empty cup." Ben's steady, supportive gaze came to mind. I took a slow, deep breath, anchoring myself in the new life I had built. "I'm sorry, Sarah," I said, my voice calmer than I felt. "I can't. I'm busy this weekend." The line went dead quiet. The cheerful warmth in her voice vanished, replaced by an icy chill. "Busy?" she asked, the single word dripping with disbelief and contempt. "Busy with what?" The unspoken accusation was clear. What could I possibly have in my little civilian life that was more important than her needs? The question was designed to make me feel small, to make me justify my existence. I refused to take the bait. "I just have plans," I repeated, my tone firm. "Fine," she snapped, and the line went dead. She didn't just hang up, she slammed the phone down in my ear. A wave of guilt washed over me, a reflex ingrained over 36 years. But this time, something else was there too. A small, defiant spark of pride. I had held my ground. The victory was short-lived. 2 days later, my mother called, her voice already laced with disappointment. The family's enforcer had been deployed. "Thora, I just spoke to your sister," she began, skipping any greeting. "Why would you treat her like that? She only asked for one small thing. Family is supposed to help each other." She never asked for my side of the story. She never considered I might have a legitimate reason. In her eyes, the roles were fixed. Serafina was the one who needed, and I was the one who provided. My own life, my own plans were irrelevant. The familiar, suffocating feeling of injustice rose in my throat. "Mom," I said, my voice level but tight, "I have a life of my own. I am not Serafina's backup plan." There was a long-suffering sigh on the other end of the line. "You always have to be so difficult, Thora." She then seamlessly changed the subject to some meaningless neighborhood gossip, the issue dismissed, the blame squarely laid at my feet. I had not only failed my sister, I'd failed in my fundamental role within the family. The final escalation came a few weeks later, at a birthday party for one of our cousins. The house was loud, filled with relatives I saw only a few times a year. I was trying to make myself as small as possible, nursing a club soda in a corner when Declan swaggered over. He had had a few beers, and his face was flushed with the smug confidence I despised. He leaned in, speaking just loud enough for the circle of aunts and uncles around us to hear. "So, Thora," he said with a smirk, "how's that little desk jockey analyst job of yours? Must be real exciting, sitting in the air conditioning all day while the rest of us do the real work." He laughed, a loud braying sound. Serafina stood beside him, a pale, weak smile on her face. She said nothing. She did nothing. She just watched as her husband publicly belittled me, reducing my career, my intellect, my entire life, to a punchline. The air grew thick with awkward silence. Every eye was on me, waiting for my reaction. Have you ever been in a situation like that, where someone in your family publicly puts you down, and the people who should defend you just stand by and watch? If you know that feeling of being completely alone in a crowded room, comment "yes" below. It's a pain that cuts deeper than any insult. I didn't give them the satisfaction of a response. I didn't cry or yell or defend myself. I simply met his gaze, my expression a blank mask. But behind the mask, inside the fortress of my mind, something shifted. The familiar hurt, the endless frustration. It all began to cool, to harden, crystallizing into something new. It was a cold, quiet fury, as sharp and as clear as ice, and in that moment, I knew that something had to break. I drove home from my cousin's birthday party in a state of controlled fury. The sound of Declan's mocking laughter and the image of my sister's complicit smile were burned onto the back of my eyelids. Every red light, every stop sign felt like a personal affront, a barrier holding me back when all I wanted to do was flee. The cold anger that had ignited in me at the party didn't dissipate. It consolidated, hardening from a raging fire into a solid, heavy block of ice in my gut. When I finally got back to my apartment, I tossed my keys on the counter with more force than necessary. As my laptop booted up, my eyes fell on an unread email. The sender was Serafina. My first thought, a naive flicker of hope, was that it might be an apology, a half-hearted attempt to smooth things over after Declan's public humiliation of me. It wasn't. The email contained no text, only a single hyperlink. The title of the article it led to was "A Civilian's Guide to Communicating with Military Families." Below it, she had typed a short, condescending note. "Maybe you should read this." I stared at the screen, my blood running cold. This wasn't just an insult. This was a calculated act of psychological warfare. After her husband had publicly belittled my civilian career, she was now sending me a patronizing article suggesting I was the one who didn't know how to communicate. It was an act of such breathtaking arrogance, such utter dismissal of my feelings, that it transcended anger. It settled into a terrifying calm. The kind of calm that comes when all hope is extinguished. I had given them so many chances to see me, to respect me. I had believed, foolishly, that one day they would change. A quote from Maya Angelou, one my grandmother used to repeat, echoed in my mind. "When someone shows you who they are, believe them the first time." I had given Serafina 100 first times. I was done. 3 days later, an official embossed invitation arrived in my mail. It was from General Morrison's office at the Pentagon, formally inviting me to attend the promotion ceremony for Lieutenant Colonel Declan Thorne. A tiny, treacherous spark of hope ignited within me. This was different. This wasn't a pity invite from family. This was an official recognition from the highest levels. Maybe this could be the bridge. Maybe this was the opportunity for everything to change. That evening, my phone rang. It was Serafina. My heart hammered against my ribs. And then she spoke, and the final fragile thread of hope snapped. I listened again to the same syrupy sweet voice, the same practiced excuses. But this time, I wasn't hearing it as a fresh wound. I was hearing it as the final piece of a puzzle I'd been assembling my entire life. Her words, for the image, people who get it, were no longer a singular, shocking blow. They were the logical, inevitable culmination of a 36-year campaign of erasure. The designer dress bought with my bartending money. The lectures on my irresponsibility versus her smart recklessness. The forgotten sickbed. The co-signed loan. It all clicked into place. This wasn't an oversight. This was a final, definitive statement on my value. And my value in her world was 0. When she hung up, there was no pain. There was no gut-wrenching sorrow. There was only the clean, cold clarity of absolute truth. Every illusion I'd ever held about my place in my family had been incinerated. There was no more conflict, no more guilt, no more wrestling with my own desire for their love. There was only the stark, unchangeable fact of who they were. I walked to the window and looked out at the city lights of Raleigh, but I wasn't looking for an escape. I was looking at the future. My future. And I knew what I had to do. I would not scream. I would not cry. I would not give them the satisfaction of a dramatic confrontation. They were expecting me to retreat, to make myself small, to disappear as I had always done. Instead, I would do what an intelligence officer does best. I would gather my assets. I would prepare. Ben came home an hour later to find me sitting in the living room in the dark, the city lights painting patterns on the walls. He didn't need to ask what was wrong. He'd seen the aftermath of these emotional detonations before. He just came and sat beside me on the couch, his presence a warm, solid anchor in my silent storm. He placed his hand on my shoulder, a simple gesture of support that said everything words couldn't. I turned to look at him, my eyes having adjusted to the dim light. I saw my own strength reflected in his steady gaze, and for the first time, I gave voice to the decision that had solidified in my soul. "It's over, Ben," I said. My voice didn't shake. It was calm, measured, and absolute. I'm done being silent. I'm done making myself small to make them comfortable. I took a breath, the words tasting like freedom. I'm going to that ceremony, and I'm wearing my uniform. It wasn't a threat. It wasn't a cry for help. It was a promise I was finally making to myself. The morning after my promise to Ben, the anger had cooled into something far more potent: purpose. My small apartment was no longer just a home. It became a forward operating base. The objective was clear. This wasn't about launching a messy, emotional attack. This was about executing a quiet, precise operation to reclaim my own dignity. And every operation begins with preparation. I walked to my closet and unzipped the heavy plastic garment bag in the very back. Inside, immaculate and waiting, was my Army service uniform, the ASU. I laid the deep blue jacket carefully on my bed. This wasn't just clothing, it was my other skin, a testament to a part of my life I'd kept separate from my family for a reason. I began a meticulous inspection, my fingers tracing each element with the care of a surgeon preparing his instruments. The colorful stack of ribbons on the left breast, each one representing a quiet achievement they knew nothing about. The gleaming brass U.S. insignia on the lapels. The sharp silver bars of my captain's rank on each shoulder epaulet. And finally, the simple, black plastic nameplate, James. Everything had to be perfect. Every detail had to be in its proper place, a silent rebuttal to their narrative of me as the insignificant civilian sister. This was more than just getting dressed, it was a ritual. It was me, deliberately and consciously, putting on my strength. Ben stood at the bedroom door, leaning against the frame. He didn't say a word, just watched me with an expression of quiet pride that warmed me more than any fire. He understood this wasn't about vanity. It was about arming myself for a different kind of battle. When I began laying out my polishing kit for my low quarters, he simply asked, "Need a hand with those shoes?" That simple offer, that quiet act of solidarity, meant more than 1,000 speeches of encouragement. As I was aligning the ribbons on my uniform, my phone rang. The caller ID showed a 202 area code, Washington, D.C. My heart gave a little jump. I answered, my voice professionally level. "This is Captain James." "Captain James, good morning. This is Sergeant Allen from General Morrison's office." A crisp, professional voice on the other end said, "I'm calling to confirm your attendance at the promotion ceremony for Lieutenant Colonel Thorne this Saturday." "Yes, Sergeant. I'll be there," I confirmed. "Excellent, ma'am," he continued, his tone formal. "The General has specifically requested you be seated in the VIP section, third row. He asked me to inquire if you have any special requirements for your visit. We look forward to hosting you." I nearly dropped the phone. A designated seat in the VIP section. This wasn't just a courtesy invitation I had received. I was an expected, honored guest. The knowledge settled over me, a reinforcing wave of validation. It solidified my resolve. I wasn't going there to crash a party or to cause a scene. I was going because I had earned my place in that room. I belonged. With my uniform ready, I moved to the next phase of preparation, intelligence gathering. I sat at my desk, my analyst mind taking over. I wasn't digging for dirt or planning a smear campaign. I was simply reviewing the facts, building a case file in my own mind to steel myself against any last-minute flicker of doubt or guilt. Know your enemy and know yourself, as Sun Tzu wrote. I needed to be reminded of the truth. I scrolled through old text messages, reread old emails, and revisited the long-forgotten promises in my memory. The evidence was overwhelming, a clear and undeniable pattern of exploitation. Then, I did something I hadn't done in months. I looked at Serafina's Facebook page. It was a masterfully curated museum of the perfect military wife's life. Photos of her and Declan at formal balls, their smiles perfectly polished. Posts about the sacrifices and honor of military families. Pictures of her children in patriotic-themed outfits. And in this entire digital shrine to a life of service, I was completely, utterly absent. It was as if I didn't exist. Every boastful post, every picture of their glittering, rank-obsessed world only served to highlight the power of my own quiet, substantive reality. They were broadcasting an image. I was living a life. The night before the ceremony, Ben and I sat on my small back porch, the humid North Carolina air thick around us. We sipped sweet iced tea from tall glasses, the condensation dripping onto the wooden railing. The silence was comfortable, but I knew he had questions. Finally, he asked it. "How are you really feeling about tomorrow?" I looked out at the darkening sky, thinking about it for a long moment. "I'm not angry anymore, Ben," I said, and I was surprised to find it was true. "Honestly, I just feel sad for her, for both of them. She's built this entire castle on someone else's rank, and she's about to find out it's made of sand." I turned to look at him, my voice clear and steady. "I'm not going there for revenge. That's what they would do. I'm going there to close a chapter, to end an old story so I can finally start writing a new one. My own story." The clarity I felt was absolute. The pain was still there, a faint, phantom ache, but it no longer had power over me. I was no longer a victim reacting to their cruelty. I was a strategist, an officer, a woman in full control of her next move. The drive to Fort Liberty was calm. The storm inside me had passed, leaving behind a cold, clear certainty. As I approached the main gate, I slowed the car and handed my military ID to the young soldier on duty. He took it, scanned it, and his posture immediately sharpened. He looked from the ID to me, his eyes registering the captain's bars on my uniform. He handed it back with a crisp salute. "Welcome to Fort Liberty, ma'am," he said, his voice respectful. "Thank you, Corporal," I replied and drove through. It was the first time I had ever entered this base as an officer in my own right, not as Serafina's sister or Declan's sister-in-law. I was not a visitor. I was part of the institution. I found a parking spot and walked toward Patton Hall. The building was impressive, a stately brick structure exuding history and authority. Inside, the auditorium was filled with the low hum of conversation. Flags lined the stage: the American flag, the Army flag, the colors of the 82nd Airborne Division. Portraits of legendary generals stared down from the walls, their gazes stern and unwavering. It was a room built for ceremony, a room steeped in tradition and power. An usher glanced at my invitation and led me to my seat. Third row, center aisle. A prime position. I sat down, my back straight, my hands resting calmly on my lap. I was an island of stillness in a sea of mingling uniforms and rustling formal wear. I watched the room, my analyst's mind quietly observing, cataloging. Then they made their entrance. Serafina and Declan swept in hand, a portrait of military power and grace. Declan was immaculate in his freshly pressed ASU, his chest a billboard of ribbons. Serafina glided beside him in a vibrant designer dress that probably cost a month of my salary. They were glowing, soaking in the congratulations, shaking hands, laughing. They were the stars of the show, and they knew it. As they made their way down the aisle, they passed my row. Declan was focused on an older colonel ahead of them, and he didn't even look my way. But Serafina's eyes, for a fleeting second, scanned the crowd. Her gaze swept right over me, through me, as if I were a ghost. There was not a flicker of recognition. In her mind, I was not there. And if I were, I would be just another anonymous junior officer, a nobody, unworthy of her notice. The irony was so thick I could taste it. I had finally become invisible to my sister because I had become the very thing she worshipped, a uniformed officer, just not one that mattered to her. The ceremony began. The presentation of the colors, the national anthem, the invocation by the chaplain. It was all a formal, predictable prelude to the main event. Finally, General Morrison, a man whose presence commanded the absolute attention of the room, stepped to the podium. He spoke warmly of Declan, praising his service, his leadership, his dedication. Declan and Serafina, sitting in the front row, beamed. This was their moment. Then the general paused. He cleared his throat, and a subtle shift occurred in the atmosphere. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his voice resonating through the auditorium. "Before we proceed with the pinning, I want to take a moment of personal privilege to acknowledge a special guest in attendance today, an officer whose quiet, tireless work in the intelligence field has had a direct and profound impact on the safety of our soldiers overseas." A hush fell over the room. Every eye was on the general. I could feel my parents sitting a few rows behind me, shifting in their seats, probably craning their necks to see which dignitary had shown up. "Her analysis has been exemplary and decisive," the general continued, his eyes scanning the crowd until they locked with mine. "Please join me in a round of applause for Captain Thora James." He gestured directly at me. Time seemed to slow down, to warp and stretch. 100 faces turned in my direction, and among them, 2 faces I knew better than my own. I watched as Declan and Serafina, their smiles still plastered on their faces, followed the general's gesture. I saw the exact moment they saw me. Serafina's face was a masterpiece of silent, unfolding horror. First came confusion, a slight furrow of her brow. Then, dawning disbelief as her brain tried to reconcile the name the general had just said with the anonymous woman in the third row. And finally, the full, crashing impact of reality. Her jaw went slack. The perfect rosy makeup on her cheeks couldn't hide the sallow, bloodless shock that crept into her skin. Her world, in that single instant, had tilted off its axis. Declan froze. The self-satisfied smirk that had been his permanent expression simply melted away, replaced by a wide-eyed, slack-jawed stupor. The arrogance was gone, replaced by a raw, naked panic, followed by a flash of pure, impotent rage. On cue, as practiced in 1,000 drills, I rose to my feet. I stood tall, my posture perfect, my expression calm and professional. I gave the general a short, respectful nod of acknowledgement as polite applause filled the hall. After a moment, I sat back down. The rest of the ceremony was a blur. The pinning, the oath, the applause for the newly promoted lieutenant colonel. When it was over, people began to file out, As Declan passed my row, our eyes met. He looked shattered. I stood up, blocking his path for a moment. I looked him directly in the eye, my voice clear and steady, loud enough only for him and the shell-shocked woman beside him to hear. "Congratulations, Lieutenant Colonel," I said. The words were simple, they were polite. But they landed with the force of a final, devastating blow, shattering the glass castle they had so carefully constructed around themselves. And I simply walked away, leaving them standing in the ruins. The reception was held in a grand ballroom at the officers' club, a world of polished wood and muted brass. The air, which should have been celebratory, felt thick with a tension so palpable it was hard to breathe. I was an island, standing near the back with a glass of club soda, observing the aftermath. I saw my parents in a worried huddle with Declan, whose face was grim. And then I saw Serafina, her face a mask of frantic composure, making her way toward me. She grabbed my arm, her fingers digging into my bicep, and pulled me into an empty hallway. You didn't tell me," she stammered. Her voice trembled, not with remorse, but with the indignation of a host whose party had been ruined. I looked directly into her panicked eyes, my own expression calm. The chaos inside me had finally settled, leaving a strange, quiet detachment. "You never asked," I replied, my voice even and low. It wasn't an attack. It was a simple statement of fact. The truth seemed to stun her more than any accusation could have. It laid the blame exactly where it belonged, on her own self-absorption, her complete lack of curiosity about any life but her own. She began to sputter, a torrent of excuses pouring out. "I didn't know. I just thought you did something in an office. How was I supposed to know you were a captain?" The words sounded foreign on her lips, as if describing a mythical creature. I didn't engage. I didn't argue. There was no point. I simply let her words hang in the air, their emptiness echoing in the silent hallway. My battle was over. I had won, not by fighting back, but by simply being myself. "Enjoy the rest of your evening, Serafina," I said softly, extracting my arm from her grip. I turned and walked back into the ballroom, leaving her standing alone in the wreckage of her own making. I left the party shortly after, without saying goodbye to anyone else. The drive back to Raleigh on I-40 was quiet. My mind was a strange mix of deep, bone-weary exhaustion and a profound stillness. Halfway home, my phone buzzed, my mother's name lighting up the screen. I knew what this was. I pulled the car over onto the dark, gravelly shoulder of the highway, the red glow of my taillights pulsing in the darkness. I took a steadying breath and answered. "Thora, what on earth was that?" My mother's voice was sharp, accusatory. There were no congratulations, only condemnation for the shame I had apparently caused. "How could you embarrass your sister like that, in front of all those important people? Do you have any idea how upset she is?" For my entire life, I had absorbed these one-sided accusations in silence. Not anymore. The boundary had to be drawn, here and now. "I didn't embarrass her, Mom," I said, my voice as steady as the rumble of the passing trucks. "I simply existed. The problem is that my existence, my real life, embarrasses her. And both of you." I took a breath, the words tasting of rust and freedom. "Have let that happen for 36 years. There was a stunned silence. Before she could formulate a response, another defense of Serafina, another dismissal of me, I pressed the red icon on my screen. I had hung up on my own parents for the first time in my life. The line was cut. When I finally walked into my apartment, the triumphant adrenaline I expected was gone, replaced by a hollowed-out, drained sensation. The victory felt strangely empty. I walked into my kitchen, pulled out a pen and a yellow legal pad, and sat down at the table. I began to write a letter to Serafina, a letter I knew she would never see. I wrote everything. I poured out all the years of pain, the accumulated betrayals, the 1,000 tiny cuts that had bled me dry. I wrote about the prom dress and the sour smell of the bar I'd worked at that night. I wrote about the 2 a.m. phone call and the terror I'd felt driving on a dark road, a fear no one had ever acknowledged. I wrote about the co-signed loan and the casual cruelty of Declan's joke. I wrote about being ignored when I was sick, being used as a convenience, being treated as an afterthought. Page after page, I emptied the poison from my system, giving voice to the silent screams I had swallowed for decades. When I was done, my hand ached. I read the letter once, a final acknowledgement of a grief I had never allowed myself to feel. Then, I carried the pages to my stainless steel kitchen sink, took out a lighter, and set the corner of the first page on fire. I watched as the flames consumed the paper, turning the words of my anguish into black, curling ash. As the last ember died out, a thin wisp of smoke rose to the ceiling. I felt a weight lift from my shoulders, a burden I hadn't even realized was so heavy. A few days later, a long text message from Serafina arrived. It was a rambling performance of an apology, full of justifications and explanations for her behavior, all centered on how she felt. I read the words, but they felt like they were written in a foreign language. They couldn't touch the scarred-over places in my heart. An apology couldn't unsay the words, undo the actions, or erase the years of neglect. I thought about the serenity prayer, a piece of wisdom I'd held onto for years. God, grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, the courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. I could not change my sister. I could not change my parents. I could not change the past, but I could change what I did next. I typed out a short, simple reply. I received your message. I need some time. Forgiveness, I was beginning to understand, wasn't about pretending the past didn't happen. It wasn't about wiping the slate clean and going back to the way things were. For me, it was about accepting the truth of who they were and loving them from a safe distance. And most importantly, it was about forgiving myself for taking so long to believe that I deserved better. A year has passed since the ceremony, a year of quiet, steady, intentional healing. The world didn't stop turning, but mine was recalibrated onto a new, truer axis. On a warm Sunday afternoon, Ben and I are walking hand in hand through Pullen Park in Raleigh, watching families laugh and children chase ducks by the lake. Our relationship, once a source of surprising comfort, has deepened into a partnership of profound, unspoken understanding. He was there for the storm, and now he is here for the calm. There have been other changes, quiet victories that I celebrate not with fanfare, but with a deep, internal sense of peace. A few months ago, a promotion list was released. I was on it. There was no grand announcement. I simply went home, took the silver bars of a captain off my uniform's shoulders, and carefully pinned on the gold oak leaves of a major. A new rank, earned in silence, for me and me alone. My relationship with my family has been recalibrated too. The phone calls are infrequent now, the conversations brief and carefully measured. The old dynamics are gone. I am no longer their safety net, their emergency contact, their emotional regulator. Serafina has had to learn to solve her own problems, to navigate the world without the invisible support system she always took for granted. There is a distance between us, a vast one, but it is a healthy distance. A necessary one. It is the space I need to breathe. My true legacy, I've discovered, isn't in my own healing, but in what I can offer to others. I've started mentoring a young first lieutenant in my unit, a sharp, promising officer named Diaz. She reminds me of a younger version of myself, brilliant, dedicated, but struggling under the weight of her family's judgment. They don't understand her career, her ambition, her choice to serve. We met for coffee last week, and she confessed her frustrations, her voice laced with the familiar pain of not being seen by the people who matter most. I didn't give her platitudes. I shared a piece of my own story. Never shrink yourself to make other people feel comfortable, I told her, looking her directly in the eye. Your job is not to fit into their world. Your job is to build your own. Your value doesn't fluctuate just because someone else is incapable of seeing it. I watched as something clicked behind her eyes, a spark of recognition, of permission. I saw her sit up a little straighter, a newfound confidence settling in her shoulders. In that moment, sharing the hard-won wisdom of my own scars, I felt a sense of fulfillment more profound than any commendation or promotion. This was the work that mattered. This was the heritage I wanted to leave behind. Not one of rank, but one of resilience. This afternoon, as I'm sitting alone on my back porch reading a novel, my phone rings. It's Serafina. My body has no reaction. No tightening in my gut, no spike in my pulse. I answer calmly. Hey, she says, her voice quiet, hesitant. Hey, Sarah. There's a pause. I was just calling to see how you are, she says. The question is so simple, so normal, yet it's one that has taken us a lifetime to reach. A question with no hidden agenda, no request attached. Just a question. I'm good, I reply, and the words are the truest I've ever spoken. I'm really good. The conversation is short, a little awkward, but it's real. We talk about the weather. She mentions the kids. I listen. When we hang up, I don't feel a sense of obligation or a lingering weight of resentment. I just feel peace. I have found my own justice. It wasn't loud or dramatic. It was the quiet, internal victory of self-worth. I put my phone down and look out as the sun begins to set, painting the North Carolina sky in shades of orange and purple. The storms have passed. The battles have been fought. I've learned that true strength isn't about never falling. It's about how you rise with your dignity intact. It isn't about having no scars. It's about understanding that your scars are proof of the wars you have survived. They are a map of where you have been, but they no longer dictate where you are going. I am no longer a secondary character in anyone else's story. I am not defined by their expectations or their dismissals. I am Major Thora James. And I am, at long last, finally free. My story is finished, but maybe yours is just beginning. To everyone who has ever felt unseen, who has fought silent battles for your own self-worth, know this: you are not alone. Your value is not determined by the opinions of others. It is forged in your own resilience. Thank you for listening to my journey. If it resonated with you, please subscribe to Chosen Revenge for more stories that empower and inspire. You deserve to be heard. You deserve to be seen.